one of the key scientific institutions in the country called the CSIRO, Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, has been the home of climate scientists, modelers, monitors, people studying the impacts on even as much as the economy. We're talking about probably a couple of hundred climate scientists, and the new chief executive of this organization has decided to cut probably in the order of 150 in the end, 70 in particular from the atmospheric and oceans group, and another 70 from the land and water. So you've got some very senior scientists in many instances with decades of experience, really being told that their services are no longer needed. And the justification given for this particular reorganization is that CSIRO wants to spend more of its efforts to look at the adaptation and mitigation. But actually, when you look at who's leaving and also what kind of new jobs are being opened up, they're not at all equal. So in fact, we're seeing in the next couple of weeks, many people leaving the field, at least for the CSIRO, and no real sign of a serious commitment to build up the adaptation and mitigation that the leadership says they're trying to promote. So I think, at least on this instance, there is a real assault on climate science, and it's being noted internationally, as it seems you've picked up, but a lot of other media around the world. So it's caught a lot of attention, and one of the reasons why, of course, is Australia occupies a large slab of the world, and if you take or reduce Australia's commitment from monitoring, for example, from these areas, it can really affect global climate efforts, including from NASA and the European Space Agency.
The cuts are really pretty scary in terms of what they say about the priorities of Australia. I'm here in Paris visiting some colleagues here. I travel, somewhat around the world. I've been to a few places, and everywhere I go, I get asked about the CSIRO cuts. It's something that the scientific community around the world has really noticed, and with a bit of alarm. For example, when I tell them that John Church has been let go, he's somebody who's known all over the world, one of Australia's, certainly one of the, perhaps the most prominent, or one of the few most prominent scientists in the area of the environment and climate in the country, and it just isn't, this doesn't happen. You don't have people who are sort of senior leadership figures in the scientific world who are just let go because someone sort of arbitrarily decides we don't want to do that anymore. It's bizarre. I mean, people don't understand it, and it reflects badly on Australia. We look like a nation of people don't understand what's going on here.
And I would just add maybe an example of how, as Steve would know so well, of course, that a lot of these programs are collaborative across nations, and it doesn't take a lot. If you take one particular monitoring operation out, and there's a few that are really at risk, whether it's ice core analysis or what we call OzFlux in Australia, or indeed Australia's contribution to the AeroNet program from NASA. It's really sometimes an instance of one or two scientists being told that they're not needed, and a whole lot of other international programs suddenly realize they have a critical dependency they may not have realized, and the impacts of Australia's reputation will linger for some time, and is presumably in other instances or in other programs, overseas partners will be looking at this and wondering how reliable is Australia as a partner, whether it's the CSIRO or maybe another government agency. I think we'll have an update early next week, but the most recent indications were that this great gem of nature, the Great Barrier Reef, as much as 93% of the reef is affected by bleaching. Some of it very severe, particularly in the northern areas, and that the parts of the north we're recording up to 60% mortality. Early next week we should have an update, just as we do understand that the temperatures have cooled off, and in many areas below the thresholds that have caused the bleaching and possibly, you know, mortality under extended excessive heat. So we'll get an update there, but there's no doubt that this is the worst bleaching event we've ever seen. And it's not probably had the profile that one might expect in an election campaign. We're only about 2 or 3 weeks into what could be about a 7 or 8 week election, so it's probably quite likely to have a bigger role to come. But to have such a major natural wonder put in you know, such a calamitous situation should be a real warning for people who are wondering, you know, what will, say, further warming in the future. Obviously, we've got a big El Nino that's lifted the temperatures this time around, but possibly in the order, Steve might correct me on this, in the order of about ½ degree since the last very big El Nino globally. So further warming, you know, the next El Nino or the one after, the bleaching is quite a significant event. It takes a while for the corals to recover, if they recover at all. And to have a kind of repetition of this any time in the next few years, of course, would really be disastrous for large parts of the reef, you think?
Yeah, the reef should certainly be a wake-up call. I'm kind of shocked that it isn't getting any more attention, that people aren't sort of talking about it and politicians aren't talking about it. This is you know, it's maybe because it's so massive, nobody knows what to say or what to think. But it's something we need to, you know, it should be shocking us into taking this issue more seriously. It's not going to go away, and this isn't just something that happens normally. I'm not an expert on the history of the reef, but my understanding is that these major bleaching events only really started a couple decades ago, the last 30 years, and that we can see from fossil evidence going back many centuries before that they didn't really happen. They didn't happen on this scale. So it's, in a way, from a scientific point of view, it's interesting because it's more proof that humans have caused unprecedented climate change, but it's coming in a very you know, unpleasant, worrisome form.
Yeah, and yes, it'll be interesting to see whether the election, it may be that tourism groups are not too happy about too much attention being paid on the reef. It might scare off tourism, so that perhaps may limit the ability for politicians to go out and do, you know, stand-up interviews in that area, and I guess keep the attention. But as Steve mentioned, the chance of this repeating and having permanent damage for large parts of the reef, which has already lost perhaps as much of half of its cover in the last 40 years. Certainly the the inshore reefs are in very serious decline already. So whether this extends to a concern about approving new coal mines, for example, which are in the Queensland state that borders the Great Barrier Reef, there's no indication yet that the two major parties are going to do anything to stand in the way. And you've got a federal government which is of the centre right, and you've got a state government which is on the left, and it's the state government at the moment which is approving these mines, has given the most recent approval. And these coal mines would add many, probably billions of tons if they ever went to their full length of CO2. They would say that perhaps it's offsetting dirtier coal in India or elsewhere, but the question must come at some point whether we really want to be opening up a whole new coal province, which would both increase shipping traffic through the reef with lots of potential risks there, but more generally produce the carbon dioxide, which will lead to further warming and more risks that way.
maybe certain people have reasons for looking the other way or not talking about this, but that's pretty shameful. I think we need to be talking about it. I'm sure they're worrying about it behind the scenes, and you know, we know what we need to do, and you know, I agree with Larry Marshall when he says we should be solving problems, and you know, we should be trying to be more of a high-tech country, but that also means moving away from 19th century industries and fuel sources. And it's a bit frustrating that that Australia has such a hard time, it seems, putting policies in place that would, or keeping them in place that would encourage that to happen.
Yeah. Yes, and I just would add that yeah, Larry Marshall, that Steve's mentioning, is the chief executive of the CSIRO, who's been leading these cuts to the climate scientists. But what we need to see, I guess, is either one of the major parties really, you know, perhaps re-examining the whole state of the Great Barrier Reef. At the moment, the federal government's main commitment is in the order of 100 to 150 million US dollars to clean up the water quality, the sort of runoff from farms, which brings nutrients and other impacts which have been hurting the reefs, the Great Barrier Reef and the corals for some time. But and while that is probably doing a lot of good, in that score, if you're not paying attention to the bigger problem of you know, the longer-term viability of coral reefs in Australia or elsewhere, with rising temperatures going beyond and sustained above certain thresholds, unless you're dealing with that, then it does make a lot of difference to clean up the runoff that's heading into the Great Barrier Reef areas now.
Yeah. Getting back to the CSIRO question, there's a bigger issue here than just cuts to climate. I think the climate cuts have received a lot of attention, but if you just take at face value what the CEO of CSIRO is saying, he's saying we want to stop doing research that that doesn't pay the bills, it doesn't bring in money for CSIRO, and that's, I think that's almost a scarier message than if somebody said, well, we don't care about climate anymore, because it says that we don't care about basic science anymore, or that we can't afford it. And I haven't noticed that Australia is significantly poorer now than it was in the latter part of the 20th century, and yet at that time there were all these innovations coming out. And there was a lot, and the climate science, atmosphere, ocean sciences, and CSIRO were top-notch, known around the world for some innovations in modeling and measurement. And you know, why is it that now that's no longer affordable? I think that's a big backward step if that's how that we're going to be thinking. So I certainly hope that whichever government gets into power, they would consider revitalizing CSIRO so that they don't have to choose between. I mean, I think they made the wrong choice, but they shouldn't have to choose in the first place. We should be able to monitor what's happening to our planet. It's pretty important, but also be able to spur the innovations that are needed to go forward and solve the problems. Yeah,
that's a good point, because there's an arena. It's called the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, which the current centre-right government tried to annihilate or eliminate, and has actually stripped out $1.3 billion of their investment in the very kind of the pre-commercial kind of research, which to develop new types of solar cells or solar thermal batteries and the like, and their opponents, the Labor Party, have also indicated that they'll take $1 billion out and effectively leave only a couple of $100 million left, and this is over sort of many years. So both major parties, in this sense, are also indicating reduced commitment to the basic science that's going to produce the kind of innovations and advances which we've seen in the last 15, 20 years. And the numbers are really quite staggering, in the sense that if you get 1 percentage point higher efficiency from your solar cells, and Steve's university, the University of New South Wales, has been a real world leader in this. The actual savings translate into billions of dollars in energy savings. So, you know, in many cases, a couple $1 million investment has multiples that are really, you know, huge, and yet they are subject to cuts really from both sides of the political spectrum, if you like. And that's also, along with the climate science, a kind of concern about where Australia's headed.